Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, where we explore the truthfulness and trustworthiness of the Bible. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today, archaeologist and filmmaker Joel Kramer joins us from Amman, Jordan, to talk about his book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. Joel, welcome back to Digging for Truth.
Hey, always great to be with you, Henry.
All right, it's great to see you 7 time zones away, or 7-hour time zone, or something like that, right?
Something like that, yeah. The sun's going down over here. So.
All right, well, we're glad to have you on the program. We've had you on before. We've talked about Jericho. We've talked about the oldest Yahweh inscription. But today we're going to talk about your book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. And so we're going to jump right into that today. Like to, before we get into some of the evidence, to start with a sort of set up the framework of this, the bigger picture. You do a great job in the book of explaining this bigger picture of this sort of relationship between the Bible and archaeology and some of the philosophical conflict that's taking place there before you get into the evidence. Maybe you could lay that foundation for the audience for us.
I think you're referring to, that really it's not a disagreement in biblical archaeology over the evidence so much as it is a disagreement on interpreting what that evidence means. And so really what it is it's a clash of worldviews. And so if you have a secular worldview that doesn't believe in God and therefore doesn't believe in the supernatural or miracles, they're obviously going to have different interpretations than somebody like ourselves that believe in God and the Bible and the supernatural and all those things. And so people need to keep that in mind when they're reading about biblical archaeology, where scholars are coming from in their interpretations.
Yeah, that's very good. It lays the foundation for us. We have to understand that conflict is at a more fundamental level. Now, one of the things that you do throughout the book, and we're going to use the first chapter as a template, but you use a puzzle analogy, and you say that archaeology does not speak. Maybe you could explain that a little bit. I think that's very instructive.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm actually, it takes me a long time to understand things sometimes myself, and so I'm always trying to come up with analogies to help me understand these concepts, and I did that in this case. And then I used to carry around a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle with the groups that I was teaching in Israel, and I took 495 pieces of that jigsaw puzzle and threw them away, and I only had 5 pieces, 1% of those pieces in the jigsaw puzzle. And so I would give those out to my groups, and I would say, tell me about this puzzle by looking at these 5 pieces. And of course, they had no idea about the puzzle just from those 5 pieces. And then I would show them the picture on the box, on the front of the box of the puzzle, of what the puzzle was. And then they saw what the puzzle was. And then I asked them, okay, now tell me about your pieces. And so now, using that picture on the box, they could bring some context to those 5 pieces. And so then I would tell them, well, the 5 pieces are like the archaeology. We find when we excavate, we find walls and floors and artifacts and whatnot, but we really don't understand really the big picture until we go to the Bible, and the Bible is like the picture on the front of the puzzle. It's really what brings context and meaning to the pieces, and so that's always stuck with me, and I use that quite a bit in anything that I'm researching. What are the pieces of the archaeology? They're important. The 5 pieces of the puzzle are important because they demonstrate that there is actually, or there was, a puzzle at one time. They're evidence for that, but they don't speak in and of themselves. They really need something, some bigger picture, some bigger understanding to interpret those pieces. And that's really the way biblical archaeology works, which is why it's called biblical archaeology. and not just archaeology.
Yeah, the secular scholars have tried to change that terminology. They don't care for that anymore. They've tried to sort of switch that, but we're not giving that up, because you're right. The Bible gives us that mosaic in the background that really gives us the larger interpretation of that. We're gonna talk about that. We're gonna be talking about Abraham today, just one location out of the 10 that are in your book. You know, this 1% that you use as an analogy, you lived in Israel for quite a long time, you and your family. And you made your way around the country, spent a lot of time there. Comment on the maybe the misperception that we think archaeology tells all when it only tells us a slice. The reality is we haven't excavated that much, even though it looks like we have.
Yeah, I mean, there's an overwhelming amount of places that could be excavated, and of all the places that could be excavated, only around 1% has been. So we're really just dealing with a sample. And so if anybody says, well, you know, that's never been found in archaeology, well, there's 99% that hasn't been excavated. So that's not really that surprising. And so, but it's amazing, staggering, really stunning, how much has been found in just that 1% sample. I mean, it's incredible. The correlation between the Bible and such a small sample of what could be excavated.
Yeah, Dr. Wood, of course, you have a relationship with him. You did the film Jericho Unearthed with him. He would use the analogy of a widget factory. You know, if you were producing widgets and
Yes.
you pulled 1 out of 100 off the assembly line, is sort of the analogy that he would use to describe that. Now, Joel, we got about a minute left. Let's set the stage. We're going to talk about Abraham in Genesis 13. Give us a little minute background of that, and then we'll jump into that in the next segment.
Yeah, we're going to talk about one of his campsites, and so, you know, he was a nomad, and the problem with nomads is they don't tend to leave anything. They live in tents, right? They don't leave anything behind to find archaeologically. But as for Abraham, he built something in this site we're going to be looking at, Mamre. He built an altar to worship Yahweh. And so this site, because it was commemorated over centuries and thousands of years, it establishes the place where he camped thousands and thousands of years ago.
Well, excellent. Well, friends, we're here with Joel Kramer, archaeologist and filmmaker. We're talking about his book, Where God Came Down. And you can buy this book in the ABR bookstore. It's excellent. Even if you're just getting familiar with archaeology, it's very easy to read. We certainly commend it, and we hope you'll pick up a copy. And thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here with Joel Kramer, and we're talking about his book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. All right, Joel, we left off. We want to talk in this segment and the next segment, we're going to be talking about just one site where God came down. And this is at the Great Trees of Mamre, or Mamre, perhaps you can correct that pronunciation for me. Introduce the audience to that, and let's start exploring that topic.
Yeah, so the key verse, or one of the key verses for Mamre, is Genesis 13:18, and it tells us that Abram, his name hadn't been changed yet to Abraham, went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron. Not in Hebron, because he was nomadic and he had these big herds. He didn't live within the walls of the city of Hebron, but he lived within the land that was controlled by Hebron. And it says specifically that here he pitched his tent, and then there he built an altar to Yahweh. And so we have something that he built there. And so this site, as we'll be talking about, is really built up over time through commemoration of this campsite of Abraham, and so it marks the spot, which is near the walled city of Hebron, and also near the cave of the patriarchs where they're buried at Machpelah.
Excellent. All right, so archaeologists don't dig up ancient trees mentioned in the Bible.
Right.
But actually, there's been clues left behind for possibly the great trees. Tell the audience about that. I found this very fascinating. I didn't know anything about this.
Yeah, so the main excavation that took place at Mamre took place in 1926 to 1928, and was done by a German archaeologist by the name of Mader. And so he peeled the layers off of this small tell. You know, we're used to these big tells that are cities stacked on top of each other. This is a sacred ground, holy place tell, small tell, and he excavated it all the way down to bedrock. And when he got down to the bedrock, there were these massive holes down through the bedrock, which he interpreted as being where these great trees of Mamre stood. And so even though the trees that existed there thousands of years ago are long since gone, we have the marks, the footprints, so to speak, of where those trees stood in ancient times. And it's not surprising, because right next to where these trees stood is a spring that's still active today. It was later made into a well, and it looks more like a well today, but it's actually a spring. And so yeah, we have these references in the Bible of these great trees of Mamre, and we actually the archaeology has provided evidence for them being there.
So, and as you and I are going to walk through those layers from bottom to top. So at the very bottom, they find these holes, and if I remember right, some kind of evidence related to the tree rings. Am I remembering that correctly? In the bedrock or something like that? Explain that, if you would.
Well, they didn't find any parts of the trees, just the holes where they once stood. Yeah.
Oh, the holes, right. I'm sorry about that. My mistake.
Yeah. The holes in the bedrock. In
the bedrock itself. So we're talking about 2000 BC. So if this is the right location, and it certainly looks compelling to me, the tradition has to go back pretty far, because Abraham is living in a tent, so he's not leaving any material culture behind. And the trees maybe live a couple hundred years at the most, right? So what's the first layer of archaeology that we find there?
Yeah, so the latest layer is the Islamic period. And this site is commemorated in the Islamic period. We have walls, we have building activity on the site. And actually that the Muslims themselves commemorated this site of Mamre is seen in the fact that when Hebron, which is a Palestinian city, when it expanded out and to where Mamre, the site is, it didn't go over the top of this archaeological site. It actually went around it because they knew this was the campsite of Abraham. In fact, the name of the site, even back when it was excavated, the Arabic name is Ramat Haram al-Khalil, which means the height of the sanctuary, Khalil, of the friend. And this is a reference in Arabic to Abraham, who is known as the friend of God. And so the site's name, Arabic name, preserves its association with Abraham. And when I first went there and saw that archaeological site years and years ago, I went and asked one of the locals, what is this place? And he said, oh, that's where Abraham used to camp. So yeah, that's the first upper layer, is the Islamic layer.
So we find that in like what we might call, from a Christian standpoint, a hostile witness, in the sense that, you know, because Islam and Christianity have competing truth claims, but they venerate Abraham. So here we have a tradition at the site 2,600 years after Abraham existed. They believed from the beginning that he was there.
Yeah, it's the same reason that the Dome of the Rock, right, stands on top of the Temple Mount today, an Islamic shrine marking the place where the temple once stood and where Abraham also built an altar there to sacrifice Isaac on. So it's that commemoration continues century after century after century, and so the good part about the Muslims commemorating that site is they preserved the memory of what that site was. Now, of course, that's just the top layer of the archaeology.
Right.
The archaeology keeps going down and meaning further back in time.
So I got about 45 seconds left in this segment. The next one underneath the Islamic materials is the Byzantine materials. That's the church period, Eastern Church. Maybe give a quick tutorial on that, and then we'll go to break.
Yeah, so that's kind of a big one to unpack, but when Constantine came to power, he took power of the eastern part of the Roman Empire in AD 324, and when he did that, then he commissioned only 4 churches to be built in the land of the Bible, and this Mamre is one of those 4 sites. In fact, the only one from the Old Testament where he had a church built to commemorate the site.
Super. Well, in our next segment, we'll talk more about that because that's a very significant church structure and other items that were built there in the time of Constantine, excuse me. Friends, we're here with Joel Kramer. He's telling us about the great trees at Mamre, at Hebron, where Abraham pitched his tent, and we're looking at his book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. And we'll be right back.
Bible in Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible in Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological Evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm Henry Smith. I'm here with Joel Kramer. We're talking about his book, Where God Came Down, the Archaeological Evidence. Excellent read. Please pick it up in the ABR bookstore. Even if you don't know much about archaeology, it's easy to read. Okay, Joel, we have we got to cover some layers of history here, a couple thousand years. So let's do it. Let's pick back up with the Byzantine material, maybe talk about that a little bit more, and then Herod, and then we're going to keep going down to Abraham. Go for it.
Yeah, so this church that Constantine commissioned, I cover all 4 churches in my book, but the other ones are where Jesus was born in Bethlehem, where he was crucified and rose from the dead in Jerusalem, where he ascended into heaven on the Mount of Olives, and then this site of Mamre is where the 4th church is built. And so why is that? Why is this the only one from the Old Testament? Well, it's because it says in Genesis 18, verse 1, that Yahweh appeared to Abraham at Mamre, and he appeared with 2 angels, and so the interpretation has always been that this is Jesus pre-incarnate that is appearing here to really announce the birth of Isaac and eventually himself, because the Lord goes on to promise Abraham that he will become something more than what he is at that point, which is a childless nomad. He will become a great and powerful nation, and that all nations on earth would be blessed through him. And so all these people that have been blessed through Jesus, the Messiah, the son of Abraham, come back at this time in the Byzantine period and commemorate the site with the church from the blessing of salvation that they had received.
Yeah, it's highly significant that they chose this spot, and they had good reasons for it because there was a tradition that could be traced back a long way with archaeological remains. So let's go down another layer to Herod's time.
Yeah, so Herod the Great, we know of only 3 sites that he built up in order to please his Jewish subjects. That's Machpelah and the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah, and Mamre. And so we have these massive walls that are still the most impressive archaeological feature at the site today, that are built around enclosing this site. And there was some activity in the late Roman period there as well. But these walls show that that it's commemorating something at the center of it. In the Temple Mount, at the center of those walls that he built around, is Mount Moriah. The burial cave is at the center of Machpelah, and at the center of this would have been the altar that Abraham built. And so you can see Lane Rittmeyer's drawing of what it would have looked like at the time of Herod the Great. And there you have, right in the center, the commemorated altar that Abraham built with these walls enclosing it.
Now, in your book, you also discuss, as we're going down further in time, so we're going back in time, now you get into the Iron Age period. That's like the divided kingdom, David, and then into the divided kingdom, a gate structure. Because of time constraints, we'll encourage people to get the book so they can read more about that. But I'd like you to move into the patriarchal period a little bit back further, and talk about why we can connect this chronologically to the time of Abraham. Let's discuss that a little.
Yeah, sure. So the archaeology goes to Herod, and then, as you say, there's a part of the enclosure, the gate of it, that's preserved from the Kingdom of Israel period, that the Israelites themselves commemorated this site. And then the archaeology goes back in the form of pottery to the time of Abraham himself, the time of the event. So you have this stack of archaeological layers really forming a monument of evidence for Abraham, where the archaeology dates all the way back down through the ages, down to the time of Abraham himself and the event that happened there, which is the Lord appearing to him, promising him and Sarah that they would have a son, Isaac. Sarah laughs, and that whole story takes place, and then God makes him the promise that he would become a great and powerful nation, and that all people on earth would be blessed through him.
Phenomenal. So this is really a chain of evidence, as is what the argument you're making. It's not just one piece, like, the Islamic material on its own would probably not be sufficient. But once you start adding it all up, and then you get to the bottom and you find the tree holes, it's quite remarkable. So your theme in the book is where God came down. And so you cite 10 different sites, really a great way to connect where God appears to his people. Got about 2 minutes left in the show here. I've always loved the way that you take the archaeology but apply it to the truth of the Bible and the reality of the God who gave it. Just share your final thoughts in the last couple minutes here on that, and I'll let you say however you want to share.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to bring out is that, of course, secular archaeology tends to dismiss all this and say, well, there's no evidence for Abraham. Well, the only way that works is if the Bible doesn't count. See, the Bible doesn't count because it's biased or whatever their reasoning is. However, the Bible does count. And when we apply the methodology, it's not a reliable historical source based on our opinions of it. There's a methodology, there's internal and external tests that when you apply to the Bible, then it comes out, passes it with flying colors, right? It's not less reliable based on the test, but more reliable. And so you got to have a historical Bible, and then this mound of archaeological layers that we have at Mamre makes sense. If you dismiss the Bible, then explain what caused this mound to grow over the centuries, over thousands of years. Why did these people keep commemorating, and in some cases desecrating and then commemorating again, this particular place as sacred ground if the Bible doesn't explain it and give it the meaning of the event that happened? Then what is the meaning? There isn't any meaning. And so it's something, it's a phenomenon that doesn't just happen at one point in history. It happens over the course of history, over the course of thousands of years, that this place is considered sacred by people who keep commemorating it by building on it. And that's what causes this mound, this monument of evidence to grow over time. And so the statement that there's no archaeological evidence for Abraham is bogus. This isn't even the only site. There's other sites that are associated, that are parallel sites with this. So there's actually remarkable evidence for Abraham and the patriarchs, both in the Bible and what's been found in the ground.
Well, that's excellent, Joel. Thank you for that, and thank you for writing this excellent book. And friends, again, we commend this to our audience. And friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. You can trust the Bible and the revelation of God's Son given in it. Thank you for joining us.